For century upon century, the world's young lovers measured their own passion against the standard set by Romeo and Juliet, who, as everyone knows, were prepared to die for their love. This was the tragic definition of a great love. But by the 20th century, the romantic, happy ever after view of love had taken hold, thanks to that magical invention, the cinema, and the fantasy town called Hollywood that would become its beating heart. It was the greatest dispenser of romantic daydreams the world has ever seen. The world watched in hypnotized fascination as those dream makers, the stars themselves, acted out their own real-life love stories. The beautiful couples, the runaway brides, the adventurers, the seducers, the love matches that worked in their own curious fashion. Some that failed, some that worked for a while. And some that were ill-fated from the very beginning. A cafe dancer called Rudolph Valentino became the screen's first great lover. As the Arab sheikh who raced into the desert with an English virgin slung across his saddle, his smouldering sexuality made him a thrilling object of desire for millions of women. Valentino's sudden death in 1926 triggered a wave of hysterical grief among his female fans. It also saved his reputation. The press had been about to reveal that his wife was a lesbian, and that he'd been known in gay circles as the Pink Powder Puff. The myth was preserved so that the great love match between fans and their idol would not die. People searching for models of ideal love were on much safer ground with Douglas Fairbanks, the silent screen's great swashbuckler, and Mary Pickford, who in countless films as the plucky but innocent maiden had demonstrated that virtue would always be rewarded. When they married in 1920, this union of equally famous high-voltage movie stars meant that the couple would be endlessly trapped in their own dazzling spotlight. Pickford found it harder to live with because she was nothing like her sentimental screen image. She was a hard-nosed businesswoman who ran her own film company. It was Pickford who orchestrated the publicity trips to Europe, selling both her own and her husband's films to a new international audience. But she would grow tired of her husband's laziness. Douglas, she once said, deals with problems by running away from them. After 15 years, the ideal match would end in divorce. Clark Gable, a lumberjack turned matinee idol, brought a tougher, masculine edge to the cinema screen in the 1930s when the movies became the talkies. And he could act too. He won an Oscar for Best Actor in 1938. But his greatest film role and his greatest love were just around the corner. Gable was being acclaimed for his role in Gone with the Wind, but his delight had more to do with the woman on his arm, his new wife, Carole Lombard. A movie star herself, she was a perfect match for Gable, a lady who could outshoot and outcurse any man. But alas, she would soon die in a plane crash. Overwhelmed by grief, Gable left Hollywood and signed on for World War II as a gunnery instructor. The Army used his fame in recruiting campaigns, but he insisted on seeing action and was decorated for heroism.
Here's where our real job begins. We're in the Graduate School of Gunnery now, learning it in combat.
At war's end, Gable returned to movies, but ever after, he seemed haunted by the ghost of a great love that he could never replace. Gable's co-star in the great box office triumph Gone with the Wind had been the little-known English actress Vivien Leigh. The film had rocketed this slender beauty to fame and glory. Now everyone in Hollywood wanted a piece of her. But a man called Laurence Olivier had got there first. One of the great stage actors of his generation and a fierce guardian of his own reputation, Olivier now felt threatened by his mistress's sudden elevation. He rushed over to America, married Leigh, and launched a new, almost exclusively stage partnership with her. It was an odd relationship in which the rivalry of husband and wife was exceeded only by the intensity of their passion. For 20 years, the marriage survived insults and infidelity, until Leigh's mental illness drove them apart. It emerged that Olivier was about to marry a young English actress called Joan Plowright. Olivier had found safe harbor from the emotional tempests of life with Vivien. Yet his new wife would have to live with the knowledge that the Olivier-Leigh love match would live on in public memory. This improbable love match had begun when Humphrey Bogart, aging master of hard-boiled private eye roles, had fallen heavily for his novice co-star, Lauren Bacall. She was now his wife, and at 19, 25 years his junior. It was Bogart's scorn for fame and public opinion that attracted her. What other star would venture out without his hairpiece? And what other star would have made such a public show of his contempt for the Un-American Activities Committee, which in the late 50s accused several Hollywood stars of being communist sympathizers? Bacall supported him in this as in everything else. She would go on to nurse him night and day during his final battle with cancer. After he died, there would be other men, but none would measure up.
My hobby is men.
Men? Why have you never got married?
Well, it would interfere with my hobby.
Mae West, as she said herself, was a late starter in everything but sex. And sex, she somehow implied, was something she knew more about than anyone else. She didn't make a movie until she was a plump 40-year-old, yet somehow kept the illusion alive that she was forever young and willing. She was mysterious about her own love life, but admitted to one great love: men.
Love? Love is what you make it and who you make it with.
A generation later, Marilyn Monroe would peel away the dumb blonde label she'd been stuck with and emerge reborn as something more than the sum of her voluptuous parts, as that rare thing, a sex goddess. Her marriage in 1954 to baseball hero Joe DiMaggio seemed too calculated to be a natural love match, a public gesture rather than a private one. All they had in common was fame. Soon her fame would eclipse his, and divorce would follow. And after that, more fame and more power. She was even beginning to displace her older co-star, Jane Russell, as Hollywood's #1 siren. Russell was merely amused by the rivalry. She was wise enough to know the difference between private self and public image. Monroe would never learn. Her whole life, it seemed, had been a search for love. An abused childhood and years in foster homes had left her vulnerable, too open to love of any kind. For the moment, the undemanding love of millions of unknown men would be safer than one man's arms. Then in 1959, she met a man unlike any she'd known, the brilliantly gifted playwright Arthur Miller. He filled her empty head with ideas. He taught her how to think as well as act. He was, she said, both husband and father to her. He wrote a film for her which stretched her talent as never before and that won her acclaim in even the highest of circles. But as Marilyn would later confess, she'd met her one great love too late. Drugs had done their damage, and her erratic behavior drove Miller away. Then, in 1962, Marilyn was found dead in her apartment amid a stench of rumors. The rumors fade, but memories of the love goddess who never quite found love shine on undimmed. Taylor and Burton went together like caviar and champagne. But if one great love was the central event of Elizabeth Taylor's life, then she had several spectacular practice runs at it. The one that caught public imagination most in the pre-Burton era was the marriage, her second, to English movie star Michael Wilding. But he would be far too placid for the mercurial Liz Taylor. 8 years and 2 stolen husbands later, she was forgiven her sexual trespasses and awarded her first Oscar. The making of her next film, Cleopatra, would produce sexual tremors of an earth-shaking size. From their first meeting, Liz fell wildly, hopelessly in love with co-star Richard Burton. The couple was soon launched on a tide of passion whose every rise and fall would be charted by the Peeping Tom media.
As a result of my marriage to Elizabeth, I became a far more important actor than I was before, though it's not very easy for me to say that. And I think that Elizabeth became a far more powerful actress.
As an admired Shakespearean actor, Burton had more to lose than his flashy wife, but the man was bewitched. The self-made miner's son from Wales and the spoilt darling of the Hollywood social set were now the world's most notorious couple. But scandal made their market price soar, and Burton celebrated by buying big diamonds for Liz. Burton had finally got a divorce from his wife. Liz had discarded husband number 4. The outrageous lovers were now a married, if never quite respectable, couple. They began to act together in classier movies, memorably in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, as the middle-aged drunks who torment one another, for which they both won awards, possibly for truth-telling. It was an open secret that Burton's out-of-control drinking was threatening the marriage. Liz, Burton once said, "Can drink, but I can't stop." The marriage would end, and Burton would die soon afterwards. But Liz would prove to be Hollywood's great survivor. In the 1920s, when figures on a silver screen enchanted the whole world, Charlie Chaplin was the most famous man on earth. And it was then that Chaplin, who'd been born in London, returned in triumph to the streets of his childhood. Not even royalty had been acclaimed like this. More than 30 years later, he would make a second trip home with a shockingly young bride. Here's the story of 2 sentimental journeys by the greatest clown of all, but only one has a happy ending. In story 1, it is 1924, and Chaplin is hailed in his hometown as the greatest living Englishman. He's a great producer as well as a great movie star. But behind that smile is a tortured heart. His much publicized love affairs have all been failures. In story 2, it's 1954, and Chaplin seems a middle-aged failure. His recent films have died at the box office, and his liberal politics in America's Red Scare period have seen him driven out of Hollywood. So, why does he look so happy? Chaplin's happiness had begun when he first met Una O'Neill, a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. Now she's the wife on his arm and the mother of his children. He's bringing her home to show her the London in which he grew up. Una's the daughter of the great American dramatist Eugene O'Neill. She was only 17 when Chaplin scandalously swept her away from her family. Already, the couple have defied the odds. Chaplin's best years as a filmmaker were behind him, but he rejoiced in his new role as husband and father. Their marriage would last, He made her mature. She kept him young. Grace Kelly was beautiful and ambitious, but tired of being a movie star, so she married a prince. It made sense when you looked at her background, a rich society girl who became a high-fashion model and then practically had to be bullied into doing a screen test, which of course led to a glittering Hollywood career that peaked in the mid-50s with an Academy Award. In 1955, Kelly shocked all Hollywood and the whole cinema-going world by holding a press conference at the family mansion. Here she announced that rumors of her secret engagement to a certain Prince Rainier, ruler of a small but desirable piece of real estate called Monaco, were all perfectly true. When Prince Rainier returned to his tiny principality that edged its way up the cliffs above a famous harbor, his future wife was with him on the royal yacht. Already it was clear that Kelly's glamour would have a huge impact on Monaco's economy, and the couple weren't even married yet. But the wedding day had been fixed, and the world's press was turning the harbourfront into an assault course. The wedding was given the kind of treatment normally reserved for British royalty. The film coverage smacked of high romance in the Hollywood style. This was not surprising, since Kelly had bought her way out of a Hollywood contract by offering the studio film rights to her wedding. What the cameras did reveal was the nervous tension of groom and bride. Were there doubts about the match? It may have begun as a marriage of convenience, but the evidence of the passing years strongly suggests that their partnership grew into a deep attachment that became an enduring love. In the early years of the century, royal love matches were more about mistresses than marriage. Edward VII set the standard, fornicating happily with a succession of mistresses throughout his reign. Then his grandson broke the rules by marrying his mistress and forsaking the crown. And someone else tried to keep his mistress a secret and failed. But here is a royal love story that began as a cold-blooded marriage of convenience, when the heir to the throne married the German princess, Mary of Teck. Mary's great beauty concealed a sharp mind, which she would use to shore up her husband's shaky sense of his own worth. And by the time he was ready to be crowned George V, the couple were blissfully happy. Throughout their long reign, the couple were inseparable. George was a shy, inarticulate man, and Mary, who was more intelligent, would help him write his speeches. Like many Englishmen of his class, George was unable to express his emotions, but he learnt to write about them. He would send Mary passionate letters, confessing that without her, he'd be lost. But now the royal couple's love, for their country and for one another, was about to be put to a cruel test. They were both of German descent, and yet Britain was heading at alarming speed towards war with Germany. They'd be fighting their own blood relatives. When the Great War exploded, it split the royal families of Europe into bitterly opposed camps. George had to change his family name to Windsor. Later there would be appalling news from Russia, where George's cousin, the Tsar, and his entire family were wiped out during the Communist Revolution. After that, those royal get-togethers would be desperately short of Russian and German nobles. Anti-German feeling had infected all Britain, and yet, at war's end, there was King George and his German wife, Mary, being acclaimed for somehow leading the country to victory over the Germans. Some years later, George would be close to death. Crowds waited outside the palace expecting the worst. But when the king and his doctors drove out, with Mary in a following car, it became clear that George had pulled through. Mary had nursed him night and day, and now he could convalesce at his seaside home in Bognor. Afterwards, when someone asked the king's doctor who'd cured the king, he replied, "Why, the Queen, of course." George would die 5 years later. Mary would mourn him for the rest of her life. George's son and heir Edward was a great disappointment to his father. Indeed, after a miserable childhood, he was sent away to sea at 7. He would grow up to become a great disappointment to the nation. He hated the idea of royal duty and would dodge it at every opportunity. But the trouble really started when he fell in love with a wildly unsuitable woman. She was a gold digger, she was already married, and she was American. Yet there were appalling rumors that Edward wanted to marry her. It was said that Edward had caught this dangerous infection from the Swedish Prince Leonard, who'd recently renounced his title in order to marry a commoner. Edward thought, what if I can have both, my lover and the crown? Edward had had mistresses before, but this Wallis Simpson woman was different. He took her everywhere. He even paraded her before the public at the races, relying on the servile press of the day to say nothing. Then, suddenly, his father, George V, died, and Edward was the new king, waiting for his crown, waiting for a queen. But he was about to be unmasked. A foreign press team caught King Edward and his mistress at their hideaway in the south of France. The story that every British press baron had been suppressing for years was out. The American press, delirious at the prospect of an American queen, ran the story for days. They spoke of a wedding already planned. They dug for dirt on Wallis and found it. She'd come from poverty and had married twice and been divorced twice. In December 1937, when he realized that he couldn't marry Wallis and remain king, Edward VIII did the one remarkable thing of his pampered life and gave up the crown for love.
I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
Edward and Wallis had a quiet wedding in France some months later. Just a few friends were present. No one from the royal family came. When the war with Hitler started, Edward was sent abroad to prevent him from being used as a puppet king by the Nazis. The great lovers found themselves ruling over a handful of tiny islands in the Bahamas. For the rest of their days, Edward and Wallis kept wandering the world as a sort of traveling freak show. But in the end, perhaps the lovers had the last laugh. If all they had was one another, wasn't that what they'd always wanted? Edward's younger brother Bertie had married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923. It was the first royal wedding Britain had seen for a whole generation. The public cheered the young couple every inch of that familiar route to Buckingham Palace. Bertie was thoroughly unlike his playboy older brother. He was bashful, often tongue-tied, but deeply conscientious. He was bowled over by Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at first meeting and pursued her until she said yes. Soon there were two children, the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret Rose. They were a happy family, living a relatively simple life until the world tumbled in on them, when his brother Edward walked away from the throne, and Bertie was summoned to the palace and told that he was now King George VI. Bertie hated the idea. Apart from the fact that he loved being a family man, the thought of royal speeches terrified him. He had a bad stammer, and his first address to the nation would be an ordeal.
My first word must be one of praise for the enterprise, enthusiasm, and hard work which have made it possible.
When the war arrived, and night after night the bombs fell on London, Britain's new king and queen rose to the hour. They refused to leave the palace, even after it had been bombed. They set a standard in courage and leadership that would echo down the years. They did not rest until Hitler was vanquished. And when the great day of victory came, it was the shy, awkward man called Bertie and his vivacious wife Elizabeth, whom the nation saluted. "7 years on, the ravages of that wartime strain could be seen in the king's countenance. He had cancer. But his death in 1952 still shocked the nation. The day they buried George VI brought scenes of biblical power. 3 queens, a mother, a daughter, and a widow. But it was the widow who would carry the deepest pain. Spin back in time a few years. It's 1947, and a romantic spark between a Greek prince and a British princess is about to catch fire. There he is, that handsome naval hero, Prince Philip, tenderly disrobing his love. His love, of course, was the heir to the throne, Princess Elizabeth, who'd fallen head over royal heels for him at their first meeting. Doubts had been raised about Philip. He had no money and some eccentric relatives. But her parents, knowing about love, finally surrendered to their daughter's wishes. So 1 year later, Princess Elizabeth, the lovely young woman who'd been learning how to be a monarch since the age of 10, gave herself in marriage to Philip, a prince from a rather mixed royal line that included some embarrassing German connections. 2 of his sisters had married army officers who'd fought for the Nazis. They were not invited to the wedding, but for everyone else, it was a very happy day. Within a year, the couple would do their duty and produce a royal baby.
It has just been announced from Buckingham Palace that Her Royal Highness, the Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, was safely delivered of a prince at 9:14 p.m., and that Her Royal Highness and her son are both doing well.
Philip and Elizabeth paraded their new baby for the cameras and said their son would be christened Charles. But 3 years later, the happy couple's lives would change completely. With the death of her father, Elizabeth became queen of the whole nation and head of the entire British Commonwealth. In 1953, when she was crowned, a groundswell of nationalism, fed by the loss of empire, became a kind of royalist fever. The young queen became an almost religious symbol of the yearning for lost glory. That yearning would be kept alive by a royal tour of the whole Commonwealth, in which the couple, and Philip especially, rejoiced in their chance to be together. But back in Britain, Philip began to bridle at being little more than his wife's escort. Gradually, he adjusted to his difficult role. Indeed, he became a constant source of comfort and strength to the Queen, as she would testify.
He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years.
Elizabeth and Philip have grown ever closer in old age. Their love has survived everything, even the sins of their children. Even as a teenager, Princess Margaret gave off powerful waves of sensuality. She had always been the prettier of the two royal princesses, the one with a mischievous sexual sparkle. Her royal status was enough to keep prospective lovers at a distance, until that long sea voyage in 1947. The royal family was sailing to South Africa in a bid to help keep that unruly state in the Commonwealth. On the ship, the usual royal formality was abandoned, and the princesses mixed freely with officers and crew. Margaret sought the company of the King's aide, Peter Townsend, a former Battle of Britain ace. He was handsome, a favourite at court, and he cut a dashing figure at Ascot as an amateur jockey. He was also married. 5 years on, there were rumours that Margaret was now passionately in love with Townsend, who had meanwhile divorced his wife. The affair was heading for dangerous waters, for this was a time when royalty did not recognise divorce, and if Margaret and Townsend were to marry, all kinds of constitutional rules would tumble. The lovers agreed to part for 2 years, and Townsend, with press vultures wheeling about him, departed for Belgium to take up a diplomatic post. 2 years later, when Townsend returned, there was consternation at the palace when the lovers said their passion hadn't cooled. The palace and the government put huge obstacles in their path, and Townsend was forced out of Margaret's life forever. Theirs would always be the love that might have been. For Margaret, there would be years of aimless pleasure, and then, suddenly, out of nowhere, came clever, handsome Anthony Armstrong Jones. There was a breathless courtship, then marriage, and what seemed at the time to be a real meeting of minds. But alas, it would not last. Margaret wanted to step out all the time. Her husband wanted to pursue his career as a photographer. They parted, and Margaret's decadent lifestyle would bring her no joy, only illness and death. Margaret's niece, Princess Anne, was a fine horsewoman, but her love life was subdued until she met Mark Phillips, who was even better on a horse. They got married, and love died. Evidence that lovers need more than one thing in common. The love life of Anne's older brother, Prince Charles, would follow a much more tortuous path. His troubles really began on an apparently happy day in 1980, when the 38-year-old prince announced his engagement to Diana Spencer, a woman nearly 20 years younger. Charles had developed a reputation as something of an international playboy, and was told by his father he had to settle down. So a potential bride was found for him, one from a classy background, like Diana, one with no sexual history for the tabloid sharks to feed on, like Diana. A couple of dates later, and the press had practically married them off. One thing would prevent this from ever becoming a love match, and its name was Camilla. Charles had loved her secretly for years, but she was married to someone else. There seemed no way out except to keep her as his mistress. The wedding in 1982 between Prince Charles and Princess Di, as she'd now be known, was a production of Hollywood-style proportions. More than 1 billion people watched it all on TV, and the only people who weren't dancing with joy were the bride and groom. The honeymooners surfaced in the grounds of Balmoral for a photo call. already journalists were whispering about odd signs of tension between Charles and his young bride. Perhaps it was the invisible presence of a third person in the marriage. Diana was convinced that Charles was still seeing Camilla. Bit by bit, the marriage began to fall apart. Adultery became a way of love for both. But it was Charles who was first caught with the royal trousers down. An illicit tape of a shockingly intimate phone conversation between Charles and Camilla was published. The prince's humiliation was complete. Diana by now had become an astute manipulator of public opinion. She declared war on the palace and was confident she would win, despite revelations of her own promiscuity. Then came that fateful evening in Paris. She and her latest lover were fleeing paparazzi when the driver lost control in an underpass and hit a wall with terrible force. Gradually, as the wave of public grief for Diana began to subside, Charles began to rebuild his life. With a series of artfully staged public appearances, he made it plain that no one, not even the Queen herself, could banish Camilla from his life. This time, the lady he'd always loved was here to stay. Camilla, meanwhile, played the role of consort to perfection. Not one wrong move, not a word out of place. As the poet said, if love is strong enough, it will find a way. From Lancashire singer Gracie Fields exchanging vows with her Italian lover in the 1940s, to the youthful version of Cilla Black marrying her Bobby in the 1960s, there is evidence that even for pop stars, love can last. But when both partners are famous pop stars, like Lulu and Maurice Gibb, the odds on a happy outcome get dramatically shorter. But there have been marriages where the partners were both famous, but in different spheres, like the long and happy marriage between Joy Beverley of the Beverley Sisters and Billy Wright, the England centre-forward and captain. Or more recently, the high-profile love match of Posh Beckham, the former Spice Girl, and her husband, David, England's football hero. But this relationship between the greatest of all rock stars and his teenage wife would never have a chance. This young man, called Elvis, broke 1 million women's hearts when he joined the US Army to do national service. Radio and movies had raised other popular singers into the romantic idol class, but Elvis Presley, the torchbearer for a raunchy new kind of music called rock and roll, was about something else, something called sex. Teenage girls wanted more than his heart, they wanted everything else as well. The one who got to him first was Priscilla Beaulieu. She was a colonel's daughter, and Elvis had first dated her when she was only 14. Elvis claimed that his relationship with Priscilla, who was then a sexual minor, had been one of chaperoned innocence. Innocent or not, it was certainly based on real love. Why else would the most desirable man in the world wait 4 years for a teenage girl to reach marrying age? Their wedding in 1967 became an international news story. At the time, Elvis's astonishing career was about to enter its third phase. Phase 1 had seen him make a rocket-like ascent from poor southern white boy to unrivaled rock star. In Phase 2, he'd declined into a housewife's choice film star. Now he'd go back on the road to kickstart the old magic. It would be good for his career, but fatal for his marriage. He would drive Priscilla away with his drug-taking. But he would always love her. That's why he'd leave her everything. Elvis's life after death would become a weird legend, as lonely women continued to pursue his phantom. There were 4 lads from Liverpool, and by 1965 their names, John, Paul, George and Ringo, had become household words, not just in Britain, but all over the world. With one bound, the Beatles had become a showbiz miracle, a self-created pop group who are now being honoured at Buckingham Palace with a set of MBEs. Soon they were seeking wisdom from holy men in a spiritual quest led by John Lennon, the natural outsider in the group, the one with the most original mind. Back in London, Lennon wandered into an art gallery and met a conceptual artist called Yoko Ono. She invited him to cut her dress, as this man's doing, into artistic fragments with a pair of scissors. For both, it was love at first slice. Almost overnight, the pair became inseparable lovers. They were seen in the more outrageous hippie and anarchist circles and launched their own notorious protest, a sleep-in for peace, from a bed in the Hilton Hotel, Amsterdam. Lennon had walked away from the Beatles, breaking up the most successful of all pop groups, and Yoko would be blamed. For years, the couple would live in seclusion, making the odd record, happy to be together, until the day it would all end in an assassin's bullet. Around the time that John Lennon was running off with Yoko, his fellow Beatle and songwriting partner Paul McCartney had been planning a quiet marriage to his American sweetheart, Linda Eastman. But someone leaked the details to the press, and their wedding day suddenly became a nightmare. It was a rare bad day for them. For the next 25 years, they'd choose never to be apart. Madame de Gaulle was a wife rather than a partner to her great husband, but Clementine Churchill was Winston's rock. Eva Peron's star shone brighter than her husband's. Nancy Reagan was the real ruler in Reagan's White House. It was Dennis Thatcher's money that gave his wife Margaret's political career a flying start. Nelson Mandela would find his wife Winnie's abuse of power too heavy a cross for him to bear. Bill and Hillary Clinton would prove equal partners in wheeler dealing, if not in sexual shenanigans. But Jackie Kennedy would bring a glamour and style to her husband's presidency. This was a match made in a politician's heaven. Handsome, wealthy young Senator Jack Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier, an elegant high society belle. Beauty, power and money were being seamlessly stitched together. Was it really love? Not perhaps in the old-fashioned romantic sense, but certainly they admired and needed one another. He gave her the perfect setting for her social ambition. She gave Kennedy, a Boston Irishman, the polish of class.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
When he was elected president in 1960, the youngest man to hold the office in American history, Jackie would move into the White House with the serene confidence of a woman who'd been born to be First Lady. Within a year, she'd transformed the place. In public, they always looked a serenely happy couple, but Jackie had been deeply hurt by her husband's infidelity. He would shrug it off. Sex for him, he said, was merely the relief of tension, something he had to have. Then came that November afternoon in Dallas. The president and his wife were driving through cheering crowds when those terrible shots rang out. When they buried Jack Kennedy, his widow Jackie displayed her inner steel. So did her young son, the boy they called John John. When the young president was finally laid to rest, the watching world was reminded that his family had lost a son, a brother, and a husband. Five years later, the Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis took Jackie for a spin in his yacht and proposed to her. To general dismay, she said yes. She was buying protection for herself and her children. The marriage had no chance. No one could take Jack Kennedy's place. When Juan Perón, an ambitious Argentine colonel, began a torrid love affair with an actress called Eva Duarte in 1944, he could not have imagined in his wildest fancy where it would lead him. It would lead him to the highest seat of power in a notoriously unstable country, and he would owe it all to the passionate charisma and flawless political instinct of his mistress. It was inevitable that as soon as he'd accepted the seals of office, he would marry Eva. In 1945, as a married couple, the Perons now became a sensational double act and rode to success in a second election that secured their power base. But it was Eva who manipulated the popular will in what was looking more and more like a fascist state. In 1950, when the Argentine economy went into a tailspin, mainly because of wild overspending, Perón sent Eva on a tour of the European capitals. It was called a goodwill tour, but Eva turned it into a non-stop charm offensive, whose real purpose was to solicit loans. When she returned home, she was hailed as the savior of the nation. Her husband greeted her with well-rehearsed adoration, and to deafening cheers awarded her a Medal of Honor. Perón began to introduce laws that threatened individual rights, and Eva would be called in to charm away any rumbles of dissent. Argentina was becoming a police state. But behind the scenes, Eva was fighting a losing battle with cancer. The day she died, the very skies seemed to be weeping. A river of grief ran through the streets of Buenos Aires. They were mourning more than a president's wife. She'd been a sex symbol, a superstar, and a mother to her country. In death, she became a saint. Winston Churchill and his wife Clementine, caught by the cameras in 1959 as they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at the Churchill family home, Blenheim Palace. It was here, Winston recalled, that as a young politician he'd proposed to Clemmy. Later, they were married in the local church. He always said it was the wisest thing he ever did. For in his great years as a war leader, as he would later write, wherever I walked, whatever the crisis, I would summon up a thought of my darling Clemmy, and it would give me strength. And he would need it to overthrow Hitler and push on to victory. Most of the time, of course, Clemmy would be an invisible partner, but whenever he needed her, she would be at his side through every crisis until the day it all ended. And that would be a day neither of them would ever forget. The day the Germans surrendered and Churchill broke the news to joyous crowds. 10 years later, and in failing health, Churchill resigned as Prime Minister, but only after his wife had put her elegant foot down. Public honors were showered on him, but the one that truly delighted him was the gift of a portrait of his beloved Clemmy. In 50 years, their marriage had to endure Winston's depressions and rages. At one stage, Clemmy ran off with someone else to teach him a lesson, but their love had been built to last, and it did. So the man who'd been the proud, defiant voice of Britain during its darkest hour stepped quietly off the stage towards his final sunset. And with him was the woman he'd loved for half a century and would love to his last breath. Perhaps theirs is the true definition of a great love, one that continues to grow long after passion has faded.